At a congressional hearing, Jeanine Pirro tried to shame Jasmine Crockett with a clipped video. But the ambush collapsed fast. What looked like a meltdown turned into the unraveling of lies live on air. Jasmine didn't just defend herself. She exposed decades of distortion and double standards, leaving Pirro silent for the first time in her career. What truth did Jasmine reveal that shattered the queen of outrage? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The chamber was full, more cameras than lawmakers, more tension than talk. On the screen, the title read, Hearing on Media Influence and Women of Color in Public Life. But what came next looked more like a staged ambush. Rows of politicians sat stiff in their chairs, aides clutching notepads, the whole room braced. At the center, Jeanine Pirro settled in with showy confidence, her bright red suit daring anyone to push back. She never once looked at Jasmine Crockett. Instead, she fixed her mic, leaned forward, and with a smirk sharp enough to cut glass, she began, Let me be clear. I'm not here to spare feelings. I'm here to remind you TV isn't for the weak, and politics even less. The room stirred. A senator arched a brow. Pirro pressed on like a hunter, certain of her prey. She waved to the screen. No need for theories. Let's see who we're defending. One click, the lights dimmed and the video rolled. It showed Jasmine Crockett in a past hearing standing voice, raised eyes blazing, fighting against a bill that cut funding from black schools. But the edit had gutted her words, no policy, no call for fairness, just anger cut from its core. On screen, Jasmine looked wild, not like a leader or lawyer, but a threat. Gasps rippled not over the bill, but the picture Pirro had framed. Then Pirro struck with her line dripping with sarcasm. If this is the model for leadership, maybe it's time we buy stronger mute buttons. Laughter flickered on the Republican side. Jasmine stayed still. She said nothing, but her posture shifted, the quiet sign of a storm rising. Her eyes locked on Pirro, sharp and steady like a marksman taking aim. No words needed, not yet, because in that room the most dangerous force wasn't what was spoken. It was the woman who stayed silent and refused to fall. Feelings didn't burst right away, they tightened. The room seconds earlier filled with quiet laughs and polished arrogance suddenly felt sealed shut. The silence wasn't empty, it was charged. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush to defend herself. She didn't stammer or shout. She stayed still, letting Pirro's mockery hang in the air like dust. Her eyes never moved from the woman in red. She waited, not for drama, but for control. Then after a slow breath in and out, she leaned forward, tapped her mic click, and spoke in a voice that didn't grow louder, only heavier. You called me a storm, but I never spread lies to help a government break women of color the way you did. The words struck like metal through glass. No theatrics, no shouting, just accuracy. And suddenly the room wasn't seeing a witness, they were seeing a weapon awaken. Aides froze, pens pausing midair. A senator leaned to whisper to his aide, but the words went nowhere. Every eye fixed on Jasmine, who now stood not with anger, but with calm sharpened by injustice. You want storms? She asked, not waiting for an answer. Then let's watch what your cameras cut out. She raised two fingers. The screen lit again, but this time the story changed. The same clip, the same room, but her speech ran whole. No gaps, no edits, just truth. Her voice played back, steady, strong, clear. She wasn't raging, she was urging. She spoke of children, mostly black, forced to switch schools mid-year because budget cuts gutted their districts. Some lost buses, others lost counselors, a few dropped out. And Jasmine's words, once framed as angry, now carried raw urgency. When you gut education, you gut futures. The shift in the chamber was heavy. Faces tightened. The air thickened. Even some across the aisle dropped their eyes to their notes, not to study, but to escape the truth. Jasmine turned slowly from the screen, letting the final words echo before facing Pirro again. Her voice was softer now, not weak but controlled. You showed rage, she said. I gave truth. But truth doesn't sell, does it? Pirro leaned back as if gravity didn't touch her, crossed her legs, and smiled like she still held the upper hand. Her reply came sharp, dripping with cruelty. Oh, so now we're watching the extended cut. The sarcasm was thick-shaped by the comfort of someone who never lived under systemic cruelty. She didn't need facts, she had framing. Didn't need compassion, she had power. The audience shifted again, but this time the whispers felt colder like wind before a break. Jasmine stayed silent. She didn't have to answer. Everyone in the room already knew. Pirro had brought a headline. Jasmine had brought a reckoning. And the storm. It hadn't even begun. But storms don't just arrive, they escalate. And when they do, they don't knock. They tear through the facade, splintering the polite silence and revealing the rot beneath. Jasmine Crockett stood like someone who'd spent her entire career being underestimated and was done asking for permission to speak. The room hadn't cooled since Pirro's smug dismissal. In fact, the air felt hotter, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Jasmine's voice, though calm, carried the weight of generations, clear, unwavering, sharpened by injustice. "You called me emotionally unstable," she said, her words methodical, exact. "So tell me, Ms. Pirro, what do you call behavior that dehumanizes?" She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her control was the power. With a small motion of her hand, the screen behind her flickered to life again. No warning, no build-up. Just raw evidence. Jeanine Pirro, seated behind her desk at Fox News, her expression twisted into performance-ready rage. The squad from hell. Delivered not as commentary, but as condemnation for women of color reduced to a punchline. It landed like a hammer wrapped in acid. The room inhaled in fragments. Jasmine stepped back just enough to let the image linger, let it haunt. She didn't speak right away because sometimes the silence between sentences is where the truth screams the loudest. Behind her, the image of the squad loomed. Ayanna Pressley, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Each a fighter, each a survivor, each a woman. Pirro had turned into a political horror movie trailer. Jasmine turned slowly to face Pirro, her jaw tight but her eyes steady, not wounded, not shaken. Focused. She was not pleading for dignity. She was reclaiming it. The room seemed to hold itself still, like even the cameras knew better than to blink. Then Pirro leaned forward. No flinch, no reconsideration. Just the same manufactured detachment she had weaponized for years. Her voice came out like marble cold, polished, immovable. "I'm not apologizing for saying something true. And if the truth hurts you, maybe it's time you turned off the TV." It wasn't just defiance, it was dismissal. The kind of calculated disregard that didn't just ignore Jasmine, it erased her. Just like it had erased so many others. But this time it wasn't going unnoticed. Not in this room. Not today. The stillness that followed wasn't empty, it was loaded. Like the moment between pulling the pin and the explosion. Jasmine didn't move, but something in the room shifted around her. The illusion cracked. The tension coiled tighter, not in noise, but in the collective realization that what had just been said wasn't brave, it was practiced. And the only unstable thing in the room was the truth Pirro couldn't outrun anymore. But Jasmine wasn't just fighting back, she was unmasking the machine. And when the mask came off, so did the illusions. The courtroom wasn't just a battlefield anymore. It was a crime scene, and Jasmine Crockett had just found the weapon. The air still reeked of Pirro's mockery, that venom-laced dismissal about turning off the TV. But Jasmine didn't rise to the insult. She didn't let emotion guide her hand. She reached slowly for the folder she'd brought with her, a plain black binder, the kind that looks innocuous until you realize it's filled with truth that cuts. She held up a single page, but it carried the weight of a wrecking ball. Her voice was calm but deliberate, like someone giving their final warning before a building gets leveled. "Let's talk about production value," she said, lifting the page slightly. "This is an internal email, dated January 14th, from a senior producer at your network." She paused just long enough for everyone in the room to feel it, to dread it. Subject line, "Tonight's edit." Her eyes met Pirro's, unflinching. Then she read it out loud, every word like a chisel cracking through granite. "Today's segment, Congresswoman blows up cut before she gets to the policy." No interpretation needed, no context required, just a damning admission, cold, casual, and deliberate. Gasps didn't ripple, they stalled, like air being pulled backward before a detonation. Jasmine stepped to the side, letting the screen behind her take over. With a tap of her finger, the full, unedited clip began to play. Gone were the jump cuts, the artificial zooms, the strategic silences. This was the truth in its rawest form. Jasmine was in the same setting, the same hearing, but she wasn't erupting. She was pleading, calm, steady, razor sharp. The topic: how a wave of school district funding cuts had quietly eliminated healthcare programs in urban schools. It wasn't just about nurses, she had said in that original speech. It was about safety nets being pulled out from under children before they even had a chance to stand. She recited statistics like a surgeon detailing a wound, painful, precise, and impossible to ignore. Then came the stories: a boy with undiagnosed asthma who collapsed in class, a girl denied mental health counseling after her school's social worker was let go, a mother forced to drive across the city just to get her child a basic checkup. Then her voice from the recording delivered the line that Pirro's team had never let the public hear. 83% of the children removed from care in 2022 were Black or Latino. It was clinical, it was brutal, and it was buried. The video ended, the lights rose slightly, but no one in the room moved. No pens scratched, no feet shifted. Even the air seemed to freeze in place, afraid that motion would somehow make it realer. Jasmine didn't look around for validation. She didn't ask for applause. She simply stood in that silence, like someone who'd carried it for years and was finally ready to let others hear how loud it actually was. Then she turned back to Jeanine Pirro. Her eyes didn't flash. They burned. "You didn't cut for time," she said, her voice low and clean, like a verdict being read. "You cut for narrative." It wasn't an accusation, it was a conviction. Pirro leaned back, fingers laced together, wearing the same smirk that had outlived truth for years. She tilted her head as if she were bored in church and replied with surgical nonchalance. "I call that editing. You call it oppression. The difference, sweetheart, is in definitions and the habit of playing victim. It wasn't just insulting, it was orchestrated. Casual cruelty rehearsed and recited, dipped in faux professionalism. A slow, elegant knife delivered with velvet gloves. The line hung in the room like a slow gas leak. It didn't explode right away, it suffocated. People shifted in their chairs not because they were shocked, but because they expected this and were still powerless to stop it. A Black staffer near the back closed her eyes. A Latina aide clenched her jaw. One white male senator gave a faint, almost imperceptible shake of his head, but said nothing. No one challenged Pirro, because for years this was the default setting. The real outrage wasn't what she said, it was how comfortably she said it. And Jasmine knew it. She had walked into this hearing not to prove that bias existed, but to prove it had a schedule, a lighting crew, and commercial sponsors. She didn't flinch, not because it didn't hurt, but because she had spent too long learning how to turn pain into posture. This wasn't just about her. It never was. It was about the hundreds of women like her who had their voices trimmed, their rage isolated, their convictions rewritten for clickbait. Jeanine Pirro had always known how to cut tape, but today Jasmine Crockett knew how to cut through it. The room hadn't recovered from Pirro's last line, but Jasmine wasn't finished. No, what came next wasn't a rebuttal, it was retribution. The atmosphere had turned heavy, thick like storm air, as if the walls themselves were bracing for impact. Jasmine's voice didn't need to be loud. It rode on clarity and intent. "You want to talk about who plays the victim?" she said, her tone measured sharp as a scalpel. "Let's talk about the people you've already convicted." She tapped her screen again. The projector hummed. Then it hit. Teen thug assaults clerk. Big white block letters. Red banner. Pirro's show logo in the corner like a signature on a crime scene. The headline glared across the room with the kind of unearned authority that had ruined real lives. Jasmine let the image hang for a beat, just long enough for it to sink its teeth in. This, she said, pointing, was your story, your segment, your label. And this, she motioned to the gallery, is the young man whose life it nearly destroyed. There was movement. Chairs creaked. A young Black man, no more than 24, stood from the third row. Slim suit, crisp posture. His eyes locked with Jasmine's, but not for long. He had no desire to steal attention, only to confirm he existed. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence screamed the truth louder than any microphone could. Jasmine's voice softened for the first time, not weaker, but more intimate, like she was holding something sacred. Honor roll student, national speech finalist, accepted to 3 universities with a full ride. And all of that gone because this aired. She glanced back at the headline. It hadn't faded. It was still there, bold and brutal. The room was silent, but not still. Guilt moved through the audience like a draft. A few aides lowered their heads. One congressman shifted uncomfortably, his pen frozen mid-scribble. Jasmine continued her words, threading rage with restraint. He was misidentified. The real suspect was caught days later. The charges were dropped. But that didn't stop his name from being burned into your segment, his image from being shared on social media, or his reputation from being crushed by a wave of digital hate he didn't earn. Her eyes narrowed, and it sure didn't stop his scholarship from disappearing. The weight of those words didn't drop, they pressed. Slowly, mercilessly, like a boot on the chest of the narrative Pirro had tried to sanitize. Jasmine turned toward Pirro now fully. There was no more deflection. This was direct confrontation. And when the system cleared his name, "What did you do?" she asked, voice flat but loaded. "Did you correct the record? Did you apologize on air? Did you give him even 60 seconds to reclaim what your 6-minute segment took away?" Her silence was rhetorical, but the question wasn't. The silence in the room swelled, waiting, demanding. It was the kind of moment that might have cracked another witness, made them stammer, retreat, reconsider. But Jeanine Pirro didn't blink. She leaned slightly forward like someone returning to a familiar pose, unbothered by the carnage behind her. With that trademark glacial calm, she offered a shrug, then said, "If he's a victim, maybe blame the camera. Not me." Her words were frostbite, detached, dismissive, as if what happened to the young man was an unfortunate technical glitch, not a manufactured tragedy. It wasn't just heartless, it was rehearsed. The kind of response you build when you spent years perfecting the art of never being held accountable. She didn't just refuse remorse, she repelled it. The silence afterward wasn't just stunned, it was suffocating. Jasmine didn't look away, but something behind her eyes flickered. Not pain, not surprise. Recognition. The cold certainty of someone who had seen this exact performance before too many times to count. Her fingers clenched ever so slightly at her side, then relaxed. She didn't lash out. She didn't escalate. Because she understood the deeper cruelty wasn't in what Pirro had said, it was in how normal it was. This was the machine operating exactly as designed. And in that moment, as the screen slowly dimmed and the young man sat back down without a word, the hearing chamber felt like a courtroom without a verdict. No one applauded, no one objected, but everyone felt it. This wasn't journalism, this was damage. And Jasmine Crockett was holding the receipts. But Jasmine wasn't just holding the receipts, she was decoding the blueprint of manipulation. The room, still shivering from Pirro's brutal indifference, didn't have time to exhale before the next layer was pulled back. Jasmine stepped toward the committee desk and tapped the mic again, this time with a steady, almost chilling calm. "We've talked about headlines. Now let's talk about how they're engineered." A door to the left opened, and a man in a gray blazer stepped forward. His walk was brisk, clinical. No political flair, just the gait of someone used to working in silence behind the camera, not under its spotlight. Jasmine turned slightly toward the gallery. "This is Derek Monroe, forensics editor. 20 years in media compression, playback calibration, and source authentication. We asked him to analyze the footage played earlier, specifically the version aired by Ms. Pirro's program." The lights dimmed slightly again, but this time it wasn't to dramatize, it was to dissect. Derek stood beside a split screen. One side showed the broadcast version aired on Pirro's show, the other, the raw footage from the congressional floor. First, he said, voice even but purposeful, the audio. He pressed play. In the left panel, Jasmine's voice blared louder than in real time, distorted with compression, her tone seemingly more aggressive. On the right, her voice was measured. Sharp, yes, but human. The gain was artificially increased by 26%, Derek explained. This accentuates perceived volume without altering content commonly used to emphasize emotion. Then he highlighted the motion timeline. Here, watch the playback rate. Her gestures are sped up slightly, just 5%, enough to look erratic instead of assertive. Then came the gut punch, and here frames removed. These edits cut the reaction shots from other lawmakers. They removed nods, agreements, moments of context. The screen went black again, but the damage lingered. Jasmine faced the audience, eyes narrowing, voice like flint striking steel. Fake news doesn't need Photoshop, it just needs intent. Her words weren't angry, they were surgical. And in a room full of lawmakers and cameras, silence was no longer a neutral act. It was complicity. Pirro didn't wait for the dust to settle. She scoffed, leaned forward, and fired her next line like a bullet dipped in mockery. "If the camera's racist now," she said, lips curling, "maybe you should sue the lens." The line hit like an oil slick flammable, meant to slide past logic and ignite reaction. A few gasps rippled through the chamber. Not because anyone was surprised, but because Pirro had said it out loud. The truth wasn't just distorted, it was being laughed at. And Jasmine stood in the middle of it, not broken, not shaken, but proven right frame by manipulated frame. But when laughter is weaponized, numbers become defense and memory becomes evidence. Jasmine didn't so much as glance at Jeanine Pirro after the venomous camera remark. She'd heard enough deflection masquerading as wit. What she carried now wasn't anger, it was grief layered in facts. And she carried it like a woman who'd had to bury too many names others chose to forget. With a calm that made the room even more tense, she stepped back toward the microphone, one hand reaching for a thin manila folder. "If emotion makes you uncomfortable," she said, flipping it open, "perhaps data will be more palatable." She tapped her screen again, and the projection behind her shifted from raw footage to a bar graph. Clean lines, monochrome design, but the story it told was anything but neutral. According to Media Watch 2022, Jasmine began voice-taught and unwavering. 71% of media descriptors used for women of color in Congress were words like hysterical, angry, or unstable. The bars lit up one by one behind her. That's compared to just 14% for their white male counterparts. Same roles, same passion, different labels. She paused, letting the numbers drip down like a quiet indictment. "This isn't reporting, it's programming." The phrase clung to the room like a warning because that's what it was. A call-out, a reckoning. The quiet violence of language suddenly quantified. She didn't stop there. Her fingers turned to the second page in the folder, this one handwritten crease stain near the corner, with what looked like a water droplet but might have been something heavier. "But here's what programming looks like off-screen." Her voice slowed now, not for drama, but from the unbearable weight of what came next. She unfolded the letter with both hands gently reverently. This was written by a 13-year-old girl. Her mother was a nurse. She was falsely accused of stealing medication from the hospital she worked at. The story aired on this woman's show. She gestured briefly to Pirro and others with no correction even after the charges were dropped. She looked down and read each word like a funeral bell. "My mom wasn't a thief, but the TV said she was, and I believed the TV." No gasp this time, just devastation, the kind that didn't need sound to hit. Jasmine closed the letter with painful care, like laying a flower on a grave. 2 months after that aired, her mother took her own life, she added. Her voice didn't crack, but it slowed as if carrying the sentence to its end required more oxygen than the room allowed. She didn't look to Pirro. She looked into the space between them, the void where accountability should have lived. And still, Pirro didn't flinch. She leaned forward ever so slightly, elbows on the table, hands steepled like a judge bored with sentencing. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't waver. It arrived as cold and effortless as a headline typed by someone who never met the person they condemned. "I don't write the script of their lives. I just put it on the air." The cruelty wasn't in the words. It was in the absence of hesitation, the indifference, the absolution, as if saying it on television stripped her of responsibility, as if the broadcast tower doubled as a confessional booth. The line landed like a blade that had already been sharpened before the hearing even began, and for the first time all day, no one moved. Not even the cameras. The room was still but not quiet. It was held, trapped inside the weight of a sentence that proved what Jasmine had spent her career trying to warn America about. This wasn't accidental harm. This was systemic spectacle. Journalism weaponized against the vulnerable. And the casualties didn't just lose their dignity. Some lost their lives. But silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's the inhale before the next blow. And this one came with precision. Jeanine Pirro leaned in slowly, lips parted, not with hesitation, but with a line she had clearly prepared long before the hearing ever began. Her voice was dry, ice-cold, hissing, and meant to burn on contact. "I don't target race," she said flatly. I target behavior, erratic, unstable behavior, black or white. The words were delivered with the kind of calculated indifference that years in broadcast had taught her to master. She wasn't defending a belief. She was deflecting a truth. And for a flicker of a moment, you could feel the familiar, uncomfortable comfort ripple through some in the room. As if a statement that broad could erase decades of targeted headlines and disproportionate outrage. But Jasmine didn't flinch. Not because she was immune, but because she'd been in this scene before too many times to count. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped toward the microphone again, and when she spoke, her voice dropped half an octave, not out of anger, but out of finality. Then why she asked, her words slicing through the stale air, like a scalpel, do only black faces make your headlines? While the white ones land in your entertainment segments, the question hit harder than a rebuttal. It wasn't a jab, it was exposure. A spotlight turned back on the woman who'd held it for too long. Pirro said nothing, but Jasmine didn't wait. The indictment had already moved to its next exhibit. With a gesture to her team, the screen behind them came alive. The familiar set of Pirro's show filled the projection. There she was, leaning over her desk, voice laced with fury, eyes unblinking, no script, no subtlety. Hunter Biden is a criminal. We don't even need a trial to know that. It wasn't just bias, it was verdict by volume. A public execution of presumption aired nationwide, uncorrected, unrepentant. The video cut, and the room sat still, like witnesses too afraid to speak, because they realized they were part of the audience who let it happen. Jasmine didn't look away from the screen. She let its afterimage speak for her. Then with terrifying calm, she stepped forward and delivered the line that cracked through every inch of pretense left in the room. No trial, no defense. Just guilt served on prime time. Her voice was a scalpel. When it's a man with power and privilege, you offer certainty without evidence. But when it's a child of color, you offer suspicion without mercy. She turned slowly to Pirro, who sat stone still. Tell me again how race isn't part of your equation. There was no applause, no rustling of papers, only the heavy silence of a room trying to remember when truth had ever been that quiet and that sharp. The reality, of course, was already known to many in the room. Even Fox News had issued a private rebuke to Pirro after that very clip, quietly admitting she'd crossed a legal and ethical boundary, presenting speculation as fact. But no public apology followed. No retraction aired, because correction had never been the point, and Pirro knew it. She sat unmoved, sculpted in denial, the kind of stillness that only comes from years of escaping accountability. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just confronting a person. She was dissecting a pattern, a cold, calculated system that knew exactly who to punish and who to protect. But when a system refuses to answer, the only weapon left is the question. And Jasmine Crockett wielded hers with the precision of someone who'd spent her entire life walking a tightrope stretched between credibility and invisibility. The room was suffocating now, not from heat, but from truth. From the slow realization that what they were witnessing wasn't just testimony, it was an unmasking. Jasmine stood at the center, spine, unbroken gaze, unwavering, and finally turned this time not to Pirro, but to the room itself. To the lawmakers, the press, the camera crews that had too often framed her fire as fury and her clarity as chaos. Her voice was quiet, but it rang louder than any gavel. What kind of news do you represent? She asked, staring through the lens of every camera, as if they owed her an answer. The kind that forces women like me to stay silent just to be seen as acceptable. The words landed not as a soundbite, but as a sentence passed not just on Pirro, but on the industry that raised her. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply let the words do what they were always meant to do, hold the room hostage in its own reflection. And for the first time all day, Jeanine Pirro had nothing to say. She didn't sneer, didn't roll her eyes. She just sat there, lips pressed together, eyes hollow and unfocused, as if the weight of everything she had dismissed had finally turned around and found her address. The courtroom lights caught her face just enough to reveal something startling. Not shame, but vacancy. The machinery behind her voice had gone quiet. And then the camera zoomed in, slowly, deliberately. No filters, no edits, just raw exposure. A woman who had spent years turning pain into programming, now frozen beneath the lens she once commanded. It was a reversal more devastating than any rebuttal. Her silence, once used as a tactic to dominate airtime, had become evidence. And everyone in the chamber felt it, the slow disintegration of authority, not by outrage, but by truth. Jasmine didn't gloat. She turned back to her screen, now lit with headlines like gravestones lined in rows. One after another, a barrage of receipts the system couldn't shred. Outrage after Fox segment fuels teen suicide. Media reckoning, how racism is edited into the script. Silence is safe until it isn't. The women media failed. They weren't just news. They were aftermath. The consequence of scripts written for spectacle, not justice. Jasmine didn't narrate them. She let them play in silence, trusting the room to read what it had ignored for too long. The images flashed like sirens' faces, quotes victims all framed once, as suspects by people like Pirro. And in that silence, Jasmine stood taller than any title. She wasn't asking for clarity. She was the clarity. And every screen in that room had to watch. Because this wasn't a victory, it was a reckoning. And reckoning, as Jasmine had just proved, doesn't always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrives with a single question that no one dares to answer. And when the screen goes dark, the consequences don't vanish, they walk in. For hours, truth had been dissected with statistics, footage, and surgical testimony. But now the final phase approached, and its impact wouldn't come from charts or clips, it would come from voices. Jasmine stepped aside. Her silence now wasn't retreat, it was deference. Because this wasn't her pain alone anymore. It was shared, scattered across families, careers, and future that had been twisted by headlines and broadcast rhetoric. The clerk stood, voice composed but trembling slightly as he read, "The committee will now hear statements from civilian witnesses directly impacted by targeted media narratives." The rear door opened slowly, and the room turned with it. Not with anticipation, but with weight. A teacher, a student, a social worker, a nurse's daughter. They entered without flash, without posture. No suits tailored for TV. Just ordinary people shaped by extraordinary harm. They didn't carry placards or press kits. What they carried couldn't be held. It was the humiliation of being accused without trial, the shame of having one's name chewed up by algorithms, and the silence that follows when no one apologizes for the lie. They sat at the witness table, not as activists, not as symbols, but as survivors. The first was a public school teacher, early 40s, dark circles under his eyes that looked like they had outlived sleep for months. He adjusted the mic like it still might judge him. "I was interviewed for a segment about discipline breakdowns in inner-city schools," he began. "I spoke about resources teacher burnout trauma. None of it aired." He inhaled sharply. Instead, they ran a soundbite of me yelling during a student lockdown drill cut out of context. That footage ran on her show. He nodded toward Pirro without saying her name. "I lost my job within 72 hours. Parents started emailing the district saying they didn't want their kids near me. I wasn't angry. I was trying to protect them. But that didn't matter. Because once you're edited into a villain, facts don't stand a chance." The second was a college student no older than 22. She wore a navy blazer that hung slightly off her shoulders, borrowed maybe for this moment. Her voice shook at first, but gained volume with each syllable. "They showed me in a protest. A silent protest. I was standing outside my university's admin building, holding a sign that said, 'We deserve counselors, not cops.'" She blinked. The footage aired with a voiceover calling us radical agitators, suggesting we were aligned with extremist groups. None of that was true. I lost my scholarship 3 days later. The school didn't want controversy. She glanced at Jasmine, her lips pressed together to keep from breaking. "My little sister stopped going to school. She was afraid we'd be followed. She was 12. Jasmine's expression was carved from stone, stoic, unyielding, but her eyes burned. These weren't stories to her. They were patterns, and those patterns had names now. Then came the final witness, an older man in his late 50s, hair fading to silver at the edges, wearing a department store suit and shoes that looked like they had marched through years of weather. He stood before the mic without paper, without preamble. He was composed but not rehearsed. His eyes scanned the chamber, not for approval, but for truth. "I was accused of voter fraud in 2020, he said plainly. It wasn't true. The paperwork they cited was a clerical error. But it didn't matter. He looked straight at Pirro as he said it. Your show ran my face across the screen. You didn't say I was guilty, not directly, but you asked, what kind of man fills out a ballot like that? I got 3 death threats that week. His voice didn't tremble. My wife asked me to stop going to the grocery store alone. My son deleted his social media to protect our family name. He paused. We had to leave our church. The silence grew heavy. I used to believe justice wore a robe. He said the words slow and deliberate, shaped by wounds too deep for theater. Now I know it's a lens, and it turns the other way. That line cracked through the room like a thunderclap inside a cathedral. It didn't need explanation. It didn't invite debate. It simply was. The courtroom didn't erupt with applause. That would have cheapened it. But the gasp, that human gasp, was thunderous, audible, real. Someone near the back choked on a sob. Another let out a shaky breath like they'd been holding it for hours. One of the interns dropped their pen. The sound it made when it hit the floor felt louder than everything Pirro had said the entire hearing. Cameras didn't pan away. They zoomed in on faces that mattered finally, on truth that didn't need to be polished to be televised. And in that moment, the hearing stopped being a stage and became a reckoning. Not just for Pirro, but for the entire ecosystem that had enabled her. The witnesses weren't activists. They weren't politicians. They were proof. Walking, breathing proof that justice doesn't always bleed from courtrooms, but it sure as hell can bleed from a screen. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her case had been made not through anger, but through architecture, layer by layer, statement by statement. And now at the summit of all that truth sat the witnesses. The very people Jeanine Pirro once narrated into caricature, now speaking without her permission, without her edits. Because this wasn't about redemption, it was about recognition. And for the first time, the lens wasn't turned away, it was looking right at them. And just when it seemed the room had reached its breaking point, the question cut through like a final scalpel to expose nerve clean, unavoidable and piercing. It came not from Jasmine, not from an activist or witness, but from the other side. A conservative congressman known more for deflections than confrontation leaned forward into his microphone with a calmness that unsettled the air. Miss Pirro, do you have anything to say for yourself? The words landed like a trapdoor opening. Not angry, not theatrical, just cold and sharp, the kind of question no pre-written script could dance around. Cameras panned toward Jeanine Pirro. Her name had echoed all day attached to footage, headlines, testimonies, and trauma, but now it was her turn to speak without editing, without anchors lighting, and without commercial break. The room watched with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for verdicts. Pirro didn't move at first. She remained seated, one hand clasped over the other, knuckles tight and white, like she was gripping onto something no one could see. She wasn't shaken, Pirro was never shaken. But something had dulled in her, something rehearsed, something automatic. Slowly she stood. Not with the fire she'd worn like armor on cable news, not with the confidence of a media matriarch defending her ground, but with the reluctant choreography of someone realizing the walls were no longer mirrors. For the first time, Jeanine Pirro wasn't speaking at the moment. She was inside it. She didn't look around the room. She didn't meet the eyes of the witnesses who had testified. She didn't look toward Jasmine Crockett, who had not only stood her ground, but flipped the ground itself. Pirro's gaze was somewhere else, somewhere past the chamber, past the lights, past the years of sound bites and catchphrases. When she finally spoke, her voice was dry and hollowed out from disuse, not volume, but absence. I deliver the news. I don't write the laws. 8 words. Clinical. Distanced. A shrug dressed as a sentence. It wasn't an answer. It was an escape hatch. And the moment she said it, the temperature in the room shifted not into rage, but into something colder. Something like disappointment. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't rise to counter. She stayed seated, grounded, calm, devastating. Her voice came steady, but it carried the charge of everything that had been building. It wasn't volume that gave it power. It was the precision, the focus, the moral architecture behind every syllable. But you create the feelings that make people vote. Jasmine said, her eyes locked not on Pirro's, but on the empty space between them, the space where truth lives. And sometimes That feeling gets people killed. The chamber didn't move. The floor didn't creak. But everything in the room shifted. That line wasn't rhetoric. It was reckoning. Cameras froze. You could hear the hum of electricity above the committee's head. Reporters in the gallery didn't scramble for quotes. They didn't dare interrupt with keystrokes. This wasn't soundbite material. This was historical record. Jeanine Pirro didn't respond. Not because she was silenced by volume, but because silence had finally caught up with her. Because for the first time, her line, "I just deliver the news," wasn't enough to shield her from the truth of what that news had cost. She had just watched person after person walk into that chamber, unedited, unrehearsed, unbroken by years of being framed as villains on her show. She had just heard a daughter read the words her mother never got to speak. She had just seen the statistics: 71% of women of color in politics labeled angry or hysterical, plastered not as a rebuttal but as a scar. And now she'd been asked to say something, anything. And her only answer was, "I don't make the laws." As if media existed outside the systems it inflames. As if emotions engineered on screen don't become legislation. As if nightly fear-mongering doesn't trickle into polling booths and police batons. Jasmine's final line didn't ask for applause. It wasn't meant to humiliate Pirro. It wasn't even about Pirro. It was about the echo chamber she had built, one scream at a time, and the reality that no echo chamber can survive when someone finally speaks directly into the silence. And sometimes, that feeling gets people killed. That's not an argument, that's a gravestone. And in that moment, even Pirro knew she had delivered the news. But Jasmine had just delivered the cost. And after the silence, after Jasmine's indictment of weaponized narratives and their deadly consequences, a different kind of voice filled the room, not loud, not confrontational, but searching. It came from a white congressman seated near the end of the dais, someone often overlooked in partisan fights, known for moderation, not fire. He leaned into his microphone slowly, fingers steepled, his brow furrowed, not in combat, but in uncomfortable reflection. The weight of the hearing had sunk into his posture. And when he spoke, it wasn't political, it was human. So what do we do with a media system that shapes bias before it even reports the facts? The question lingered. It wasn't pointed at Jasmine nor Pirro. It was aimed at the structure itself. A system of spotlights that distort more than they reveal. The silence afterward wasn't tense. It was contemplative, even reverent. The kind of stillness that follows when truth has peeled away performance. Jasmine didn't rush her answer. She let it breathe. Let the room sit in the discomfort it had spent decades denying. Then, with a voice steady as steel, she responded, not like a pundit, but like someone who'd had to navigate every word of her public life through a minefield of assumptions and distortions. First, she said, her tone sharp yet composed, "Let's call it what it is. Not conservative media. It's weaponized speech. No gas, no yelling. Just impact, heavy, direct, and inarguable." The words struck the committee like coordinates on a map they had refused to unfold. The kind of language that doesn't provoke debate, but reveals the lie at the heart of it, that media bias is just opinion and not strategy. She didn't need to elaborate. Everyone in the room knew what she meant. The headlines that criminalize black children and romanticize white shooters. The segments that turned grieving mothers into angry caricatures. The clips that removed nuance and looped outrage because it sold. Because it kept power in the hands of the loudest, not the most truthful. For a long moment, even Pirro didn't speak. Her earlier smirks had vanished. Her posture stiffened like the armor was cracking, and she could feel the weight of what it had defended. But this wasn't about her anymore. This was about systems. Across the table, committee staffers exchanged glances. Aides passed notes. Papers began moving. What had started as a public reckoning was now turning into legislative momentum. Jasmine had done more than speak truth, she had shifted frame. A vice chair, a longtime skeptic of regulating media, cleared his throat and raised a document for review. A draft bill. Title still unwritten. But its contents, at least in spirit, had already been outlined during this hearing. Oversight of manipulative broadcast techniques. Clear labeling of editorialized content. Consequences for knowingly airing falsehoods designed to provoke racial or gender-based hostility. The conversation was changing not into censorship, but accountability. Jasmine didn't need to say another word. The facts were already speaking for her, and what mattered more was that the momentum wasn't being carried by outrage, but by truth with proof. Video manipulation, segment tampering, emotional engineering disguised as debate. It was all on record now, not just as testimony, but as precedent. Another congresswoman leaned forward, speaking not to the room but into history. What we've witnessed today isn't just emotional testimony, it's constitutional clarity. Speech is free. Harm isn't. That line too stuck. And Jasmine, she didn't smile. She didn't gloat. Her shoulders didn't relax, because she knew this was just the beginning. But for once, the room wasn't asking her to defend her anger. It was asking what to do with the evidence of injustice she had made undeniable. And that was a beginning, not of noise, of policy. Transitioning from legislative climax to public reckoning required no script, just a single moment of unfiltered clarity. Jasmine Crockett stepped beyond the congressional chamber, the floor still humming behind her, with the tension of historic confrontation. Her heels echoed down the marbled hallway with the weight of what had just transpired. Around her, aides whispered, reporters scrambled, and the guards tried to contain the chaos of a press corps hungry for post-hearing soundbites. But Jasmine wasn't in a hurry. She moved like a woman who had just reshaped the landscape, not with fury, but with evidence. Not with noise, but with conviction. Outside the chamber, daylight cut through the rotunda windows, slashing across the polished stone like truth through silence. Jasmine walked past it, all the flashes, the chaos, the murmurs, and locked eyes with a single camera. It was positioned in the center of the hallway, carried by a field journalist broadcasting live on a cable news network that once distorted her image. The camera didn't blink. Neither did she. She didn't raise her voice, didn't clear her throat. Her face was unreadable, but her presence was electric, like a storm that had already passed but left the charge lingering in the air. She paused for half a beat, just enough to let the silence fall around her like a curtain. Then she looked directly into the lens, not at the journalist behind it, not at the millions watching from couches or phones, but into the instrument itself, the eye of the system that had watched women like her bleed, misframe, and move on. And she said, calm as thunder, just before it breaks, "The day black women are still called too emotional, just for speaking up, is the day America hasn't even finished its introduction." It wasn't just a statement, it was a verdict. A line aimed not at one opponent, but at centuries of institutional doubt. The camera caught every syllable, the close-up framing her, not as an aggressor, not as a victim, but as a standard. She didn't wait for a follow-up. She didn't offer clarifications. She turned and walked away, her silhouette trailing down the hall, like punctuation after a national truth bomb. The clip aired live. The news anchor stuttered for a moment, visibly unsure whether to pivot or let the moment breathe. They chose wrong. They cut to commercial, but it was too late. Within 90 seconds, someone clipped the footage and uploaded it to Twitter. Within 5 minutes, it was reposted by the congressional press pool. Within 12 hours, it had over 8 million views across platforms. That sentence, 11 words, lit up the internet like a courtroom gavel cracking through glass. By midnight, celebrities reposted it. Ava DuVernay, Kerry Washington, Viola Davis. By sunrise, college professors were citing it. By the next day, it was reprinted in op-eds, dissected on MSNBC, blasted on Fox News with alarm, and turned into protest banners in front of news headquarters from Atlanta to Los Angeles. What struck people wasn't just the sentence, it was the timing. Jasmine hadn't said it in the middle of chaos. She hadn't shouted it over someone else. She had waited until the system was done talking, until every argument had been made, every tactic deployed, and only then did she drop a truth that felt so quiet it roared. The line didn't need to be explained, it carried its own history. Generations of silencing of black women, told to sit, to calm down, to smile more, to not make it about race. Generations of brilliance misnamed as anger of resistance, mislabeled as threat. But here it was now, said in real time by a congresswoman on record, with the entire nation watching. What began as a courtroom-style hearing had ended as a cultural tsunami. Late-night hosts played the clip not for laughs, but for its sting. If that's not the line of the decade, one host said, then we've all been watching the wrong channels. Editorial writers called it the new, "I am not your Negro." Public figures who once remained silent on media injustice, especially involving Black women, were forced to respond, because to say nothing now was to side with distortion. Meanwhile, at the heart of it all, Jasmine refused interviews. She didn't tour the networks. She didn't amplify the tweet. She let it ride on its own power, and that made it even louder. But in neighborhoods across the country, it wasn't the virality that mattered most. It was the recognition. Black mothers quoted it at PTA meetings. High schoolers printed it on T-shirts. Young interns in newsrooms, long silenced when they questioned edits, headlines, or segment framing, now had a sentence to point to a congresswoman's words to ground their instincts. And in private rooms, the ones Jasmine wasn't invited to, the editorial meetings, the network boardrooms, the analytics briefings, something began to shift. It wasn't revolution yet, but it was discomfort. It was visibility that refused to be manipulated. The sentence didn't just travel, it landed. And somewhere alone in her apartment that night, Jasmine finally sat down. No lights on, just the glow of a muted television screen and her phone buzzing beside her with alerts she didn't open. She didn't need to. Her words were already echoing in buildings she'd never enter, among people who once doubted her tone more than they questioned their own judgment. She didn't write history that day. She reminded America that it hadn't even started. And as her words echoed across the nation, the question wasn't whether they would be remembered, but whether America was finally ready to listen. The hearing was over, but the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the kind of stillness that settles after a building has collapsed, heavy suspended, waiting to be understood. Jasmine Crockett had walked through fire not to emerge unburned, but to show every scar. She hadn't come to Capitol Hill for applause. She came to confront a system that had polished its bias into broadcast and sold it as truth. She came to speak where so many others had been erased mid-sentence. And when she finally stepped out from behind that microphone, she left behind more than just silence. She left behind a reckoning. Because the story wasn't just about one woman. It was about a nation addicted to optics and allergic to accountability. Jasmine's confrontation with Jeanine Pirro didn't begin that morning. It began decades earlier in living rooms and newsrooms across America, where Black women were labeled too loud, too angry, too unstable, when in fact they were too honest for comfort. Jeanine Pirro had spent years shaping narratives that could fit inside a headline, but couldn't hold the truth. She framed emotion as instability, edited righteousness into rage, and stripped context from conflict until all that remained was caricature. Her broadcasts didn't simply report the news, they weaponized it. And Jasmine, standing in the blast zone of that legacy, didn't flinch. She responded not with vengeance, but with precision. Her every word wasn't just a rebuttal, it was an autopsy of what media power had done to people like her. There's a difference between being misunderstood and being deliberately misrepresented. Jasmine knew that difference well. She had watched her own image be chopped, sped up, amplified, framed not by accident, but by design. A pause before a statement turned into a scowl. A raised eyebrow became a threat. A protective voice for children became hysteria. She had lived through the transformation of truth into spectacle of advocacy, into threat of identity, into indictment. And still she stood. Because the lesson wasn't just about journalism, it was about language, about the words used to dismiss and the silences used to destroy, about how entire communities are trained to doubt their own clarity because a news anchor told them, calm down. Jasmine didn't just fight back, she named the violence. Not physical violence, but narrative violence. The kind that strips someone's humanity in 90 seconds and replays it until the world stops asking what really happened. The kind that doesn't need a gun to kill opportunity. It only needs an edit button and an audience that never questions what it's fed. Her battle cry, the day Black women are still called too emotional just for speaking up, is the day America hasn't even finished its introduction, wasn't a slogan. It was a verdict. It was a warning to those who confuse presence with privilege, who think inclusion is the same as power, who believe a camera pointing at you is the same as being heard. And America listened. Not all of it, not willingly, but enough. Enough that her words rippled beyond the hearing room. Enough that school teachers printed her quote for classroom walls. Enough that victims once silenced by shame sent her letters saying, "Now I know I wasn't overreacting. I was just unheard." Jasmine hadn't just defended herself. She had given voice to those still too scared to speak. The emotional climax didn't come from yelling, it came from restraint. It came from the way she held her breath in the face of mockery, from the way she unspooled receipts with calm fury, from the way she used truth as her only weapon. And that is what made her unstoppable. Not because she shouted louder, but because she refused to be shrunk. Jeanine Pirro stood for a generation of media that confused cruelty with courage. Jasmine Crockett stood for something else entirely, a generation done apologizing for survival, done softening their tone to be palatable, done being rewritten in real time by people who never bothered to understand the stakes. In a country where Black women are told to be grateful for being allowed to speak, Jasmine rewrote the rules. She didn't ask for the mic. She took it. And when they tried to cut her time short, she used their footage against them. She flipped the narrative like a mirror, showing not just what they said about her, but what it said about them. The human cost of media manipulation was no longer abstract. It was sitting in the audience. It was visible in the eyes of the young man once labeled a thug, in the trembling voice of a daughter reading her late mother's words, in the stories that followed her testimony like shadows, lives altered, dreams, derailed reputations, wrecked. This wasn't theater. This was truth on trial, and Jasmine Crockett. She didn't just win, she documented the wound. She made the damage undeniable. She didn't scream for sympathy, she delivered the evidence. So what is the human lesson? That truth is not always convenient, that rage is not always irrational, and that sometimes the loudest voice in the room is the one telling you, you don't get to silence me just because you're uncomfortable with what you've done. Jasmine didn't seek vengeance. She offered visibility. She didn't call for censorship, she demanded consequence. She didn't destroy Jeanine Pirro. She disarmed her with facts, with testimony, with a kind of composure born only from surviving 1,000 silent attacks. And now her words live on, not because they were trending, but because they were true, because they reminded a country still in denial that justice doesn't begin with verdicts, it begins with voice. And Jasmine Crockett gave hers not to punish, but to protect the next generation from inheriting a lie. Picking up the thread of Jasmine's final words, the camera didn't just cut to commercial, it cut deep into the national conscience. Because what happened in that hearing room was not just a moment of reckoning, it was a mirror. A mirror for anyone who's ever watched the news and swallowed bias disguised as facts. A mirror for every boardroom that dismissed the lone Black woman for being too much. For every classroom where a young girl was told to calm down when she was simply standing up. Jasmine's confrontation wasn't theoretical, it was a blueprint, a battle plan for how to respond when institutions bend truth into spectacle and use shame as a muzzle. In everyday life, media doesn't need to be Fox News to be harmful. It shows up in how job applicants are perceived based on voice and tone, in how teachers discipline one student more harshly than another, not because of behavior, but because of perception. It shows up when a woman raises her hand in a meeting and hears, maybe let someone else speak now. It shows up in courts and hospitals in the way police reports are written, edited, and aired before the victim even gets a lawyer. And most of all, it shows up in silence, the kind that follows after someone has been publicly misrepresented and no one says a word. The lesson here is razor sharp. If you don't control the narrative, it will be used to control you. Jasmine didn't just reclaim her story, she exposed the architecture of distortion. The cameras, the edits, the framing, they're not neutral. They're choices. And those choices have consequences. Just like the young man in the audience, whose future was nearly destroyed by a headline, many walk through life wearing labels they didn't earn, trapped in scripts they didn't write. So what do? We question the frame. We pause the clip. We ask, what's missing here? Whose voice got cut? And more importantly, who benefits from this version of the story? Because as Jasmine proved, the most radical act is not yelling louder, it's revealing what was intentionally left out. That's how we win. One story at a time, one correction at a time, one truth at a time, and sometimes all it takes is one woman who refuses to be edited. But there's more. That hearing wasn't just a clash between two women, it was a warning to a nation hooked on sound bites. For decades, we've been taught to trust the headline, the Chiron, the 5-second flash. But truth doesn't live in 5 seconds. It lives in the spaces between sentences. It lives in the context cut away for drama. That day, Jasmine forced Congress and America to face a hard truth. Justice requires the full story. Pirro's clip drew chuckles. Jasmine's clip drew silence. And silence, the heavy kind, means the frame just cracked. It reminded us that injustice hides not only in laws or votes, but in edits and captions. It happens when angry is used to dismiss, when too emotional is used to erase, when storm is used to discredit. The real danger isn't always the lie. It's the half-truth, the cropped photo, the single quote stripped of meaning. Jasmine exposed that a media machine that doesn't just report, but reshapes often at devastating cost. So the responsibility is ours too, to pause before we share a clip, to read beyond a headline, to ask who gains if I accept this version, whose humanity gets erased if I don't question it, because silence isn't neutral. Framing isn't neutral. Even laughter isn't neutral when it comes at the expense of truth. In that chamber, Jeanine Pirro brought a headline. Jasmine Crockett brought a reckoning. And the storm, it wasn't rage. It was truth. And truth, once freed from the cut, the caption, the frame, is unstoppable. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.